The public hate the idea that politicians say, oh, my hands are tied. The public are voting for you to make a change. That's why Brexit matters, because it removes that opportunity to make that excuse. You're also right that people were voting for a change in migration. They were voting for control and for a reduction, particularly in low-skilled migration as it affects wages.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Natasha Feroze, and today I am joined by Michael Gove, our editor, to discuss his cover piece this week. Michael has looked at Starmer versus the workers, and he's asked the question, why is Labour forgotten about the left-wing case for Brexit? Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Natasha.
Now, you've been talking this week for the cover piece about Brexit, and before we get into it, I wanted to ask, has it brought back happy memories?
It's brought back very mixed memories, I have to say, because while there were aspects of the Brexit campaign that I did enjoy, and people whom I enjoyed working with, and I was very pleased by the result, the agonies that followed were certainly painful. And of course, some of the debates and some of the personal consequences that were involved in Brexit were painful for me and for others.
And one of those memories that you talked about is very specifically in 2019, just days before Theresa May ended up resigning, you were faced with a situation where you had to appeal to the opposition to get the Brexit deal over the line.
Yes, so as viewers may recall, and they'll probably find it painful to recall this as well, when Theresa was trying to get her Brexit deal through, there were a succession of so-called meaningful votes. And with every attempt, she inched towards getting more support from Conservative MPs, but it was still the case that there was an unbudgeable minority who were opposed. And it was also the case that there'd been a series of ministerial and other resignations because people were deeply unhappy within the Conservative Party at the compromises involved. So Theresa resolved on one last desperate throw of the dice, which was seeing if Labour, who were nominally committed to honouring the Brexit vote, would agree. So talks were convened with David Lidington on one side and on the other side, Keir Starmer, to see if there was any room for manoeuvre. And I was enlisted, I was Environment Secretary at the time, to deal with some of the issues around, sort of SPS, which we've heard about this week in the New Deal, the whole process of food and farming checks and trade. So I normally just uncharacteristically stuck to what I was supposed to be sticking to. But there was just one moment when Labour were running through their red lines all over again. And one of the things that Keir Starmer was very insistent on is that Labour should be, consulted in such a way as to ensure that Britain stayed in the single market effectively. And I said, I don't think it was so much that my patience snapped. I was just irritated at that point. And I said, look, why do you want to stay in the single market? The whole point about Labour is it is there as a party to exercise democratic control over capital. The whole point about the single market is that a foreign jurisdiction can tell a democratically elected government whether or not it can subsidise this industry, what its level of support should be for its manufacturing sector, and so on. The whole point about the single market is it prevents a left-wing government being on the side of working people. And I said, that's why people voted, including my parents, for Labour in 1983. Now, I made the argument perhaps with a twinkle in my eye, but sincerely challenging them. And as I looked across, I could see that Keir Starmer thought, he just looked blank. And also in the room were John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, who I think thought, why is this guy going on? There was one person on the other side who I think got it. And the irony is that he was Jeremy Corbyn's right-hand man, his director of communications, Seamus Milne, who had been a Guardian comment editor. And the thing about Seamus is that he was a long-time Eurosceptic, not because he was, like me, a sort of Tory, but because he was an avowed Marxist. And he recognised that there was truth in what I was saying, that if you wanted to have genuine radical change, albeit left or right, then you couldn't do it within the constraints of the EU single market.
But the left Eurosceptics this week have remained quite quiet. Have you noticed anything that you've said in your cover piece? They've said, actually, yes, I agree with you. I support Michael Gove as saying we've actually invited John McDonnell on Spectator TV. He said, no, thank you. We invited Jeremy Corbyn on. He said no thank you, but I thought maybe they would agree with your piece.
Well, I think that for some of the people who've been Eurosceptic on the left, they've sort of I think there are two things. One, some of them think, these are old battles. There are new battles now to fight, whether that's on welfare or on Gaza or other issues. So the heat's gone out of it. And I think the second thing is that there'll be some people on the Labour left, including those who have a sympathy with Brexit, who will think, I don't want to cause too much trouble for the leadership overall. But there's an interesting thing, and I think it's a generational thing. I think that what you do now have is a generation of blue Labour people who may not necessarily want to revisit the Brexit debate, but who have a lot of sympathy with the Leave arguments and Leave positions. So if you look at what people like Jonathan Hinder or Dan Carden have been saying, new Labour MPs recently, well, in Dan's case he was elected a little while ago, but in Jonathan Hinder's case just at the last election, who are associated with Maurice Glassman, associated with the Blue Labour movement, they're very clear that they want controlled migration. They're very impatient with the way in which a democratically elected government is constrained by things like the ECHR or Quango culture. They're very keen on the principle of taking back control, and they want, since Keir Starmer has used the phrase, to make it real. So I think that even if they don't want to revisit the whole Brexit settlement, they understand why so many people, broadly 40% of Labour voters, voted Leave, and many of those were precisely the voters who lent their votes to Boris in 2019 and then came home to Labour in 2024. And
you don't think that under Starmer's Brexit reset, some people calling it a Brexit betrayal, you don't think that base are supportive of Starmer's New Deal? No, I don't think so particularly. I think the key thing, and the point I tried to make in the article, is this is not, to be fair, a huge betrayal. It certainly is if you're in the fishing sector, and that means a lot to me because of my family background in the northeast of Scotland. So I feel it keenly. But I'm trying to be objective, and actually the Brexit reset is more about things that will happen in the future, promises to explore things, than a massive change now. But it does signal a direction of travel, and it's a direction of travel away from what some in Blue Labour and also consistent Labour Eurosceptics like Maurice Glassman have argued for, which is using the domestic levers that have been repatriated as a result of Brexit to move economic policy in a direction which is broadly the levelling up direction, which Boris was talking about and which I was very supportive of. And we do have a piece by Richard Johnson, also in the magazine. I know you've talked to Richard. Richard is a Labour supporter, long-time Labour supporter, and an academic. And Richard is part of that group of people, and they include people like the Harvard academic Richard Tuck on the left, who always supported Brexit and have been consistent in doing so because they believe, essentially, and this goes back to Clement Attlee, to Hugh Gaitskell, to Peter Shaw, that the purpose of a Labour government is to have democratic accountability as you use the powers of the state to promote social justice. Just picking up on the point you make about fishing, because it is something that's clearly personal to you. It's something that Gus Carter wrote about, why fishing matters. I'd encourage our viewers to go and read that piece. It was fascinating. But I've also read that under Starmer's new reset with cutting red tape, the fishermen are going to be some of the first people to benefit from such few restrictions at the border. Well, it is the case that for some fish exports, and indeed for some other food exports, for food exports generally, that there will be no obligation on the EU to impose checks according to their own laws and principles. But I'd say three things. Firstly, we haven't lowered our food standards at all. So the requirement that the EU impose these checks is a legalistic argument, not a practical one. We don't impose checks on the EU because we're confident in their high food standards, even though there have been examples like the horse meat scandal in the past where actually we've imported food from Europe where there have been health issues. So there's no requirement for the EU to do so. It's just a legal procedure. Anyway, they're lifting that legal procedure, and that's been welcomed by people, particularly in the aquaculture, the fish farming sector. But for the catching sector, the alleged ease of access, or the apparent ease of access, doesn't make up
for the fact that the capacity to fully take back control of our own waters, which is what they had advocated for, has gone. And then, of course, people argue, relatedly, third point, that our fishing sector is so small that its impact on the economy is tiny. And I think it was the Spectator that broke the news this week that actually, I think its OnlyFans makes more money for the UK economy than fishing. But that's a consequence of the decline of the sector. And Richard Johnson makes the point that if you invest properly, you can allow that sector to grow. And there are other jurisdictions smaller than our own, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, that have thriving fishing sectors. If anyone to visit Iceland, you would see that it was a thriving modern economy, and fishing, sustainably done, is one of the most effective ways of ensuring that we can have both the protein-rich food that we will need in the future and that it is an endlessly recurring resource. But as I say, my passion and support for the fishing sector, I recognise, is still a minority interest.
Did you think it was prudent for Keir Starmer to have a Brexit reset or a renegotiation of the deal? Because, looking at a YouGov poll, I think a lot of people have been talking about the idea of regrets it. People wish that did vote for to leave and now wish they hadn't. The YouGov poll has calculated that 55% of Britons now say it was wrong for the UK to leave the EU, with just 11% seeing Brexit as more of a success than a failure. So he had to do something.
Well, I think it's extremely unlikely that he would have done anything I would have requested of him. Sure. But I would have argued that he should have gone down a very different path. I think one of the reasons why people regret Brexit is because both the governments of which I was part and so far this government haven't really shown that they properly understand what the vote was about. So, when I was in government, the signal Brexit successes were assumed to be these great new trade deals, Australia, New Zealand, all the rest of it. In government, I wasn't against free trade deals, but I was very sceptical about our anxiety to rack up these deals and the fact that we would not negotiate as hard as we should. And I thought that the deals with Australia in particular were bad for domestic agriculture. But more than that, I actually thought that the key thing is not trade deals, which signify paying attention to the Brexit vote, because trade didn't play that much of a part in the Vote Leave campaign. I was there at the time. The key thing about the Vote Leave campaign is it was about the capacity to change domestic law and to change the domestic political economy. It was about making sure that we could support manufacturing, cut VAT on fuel, make sure that we could spend more on the NHS and critically on science and technology. One of the things that we may lose as a result of this Brexit deal is the capacity to have the right regulatory framework in science and technology, in gene editing and in AI to power economic growth. What I wanted to see in particular, and Boris was the best articulator of this, was a rebalancing of our economy so that the people who'd lost out through globalisation, particularly in the North and Midlands, particularly in the manufacturing sector, saw that the government was on their side. We did that only fitfully. And as a result, we forfeited the faith and trust of people who had voted Brexit. My suggestion, stroke prediction, in the article is that whatever the nature of our relationship with the EU, and as I say, I've got my worries about this deal, but not massive, but they are definitely there. But my worry is that Starmer won't recognise the real reason why people voted for leave, and the fact that he's gone in this direction suggests that he doesn't want to use the levers that were available in order to have a political economy that respects that vote.
But when you say the real reasons why people voted to leave, there were so many reasons why people voted to leave. And I'm just thinking back about the Brexit time. I speak to some people, they'd say it's democracy for me. Other people would say it's corruption in the EU government. Lots of people would say it's immigration. So do you think that the vote leave messaging post-Brexit was that they didn't harness on the wins? I think, the vaccine mandate, the vaccine rollout was actually one of the examples.
Oh, completely. So I think again, Richard Johnson makes the point that Brexit is a constitutional revolution in the original sense of the word. It means the renovation, the regeneration of a constitution. I completely agree with you. The single most important thing about Brexit is democratic accountability and the fact that politicians cannot hide behind the fact that they're being told what to do by foreign courts. There's an irony, of course. Then we could be talking about the Chagos deal in that context. But the public hate the idea that politicians say, "Oh, my hands are tied." The public are voting for you to make a change. That's why Brexit matters, because it removes that opportunity to make that excuse. You're also right that people were voting for a change in migration. They were voting for control and for a reduction, particularly in low-skilled migration as it affects wages. And people were also rejecting the whole way in which the EU was governed, and as you say, the corruption and the opacity of it. And one of the arguments that I make is that people quite rightly felt that the way in which the EU operates is great if you're a human rights lawyer or a Goldman Sachs banker, not so much if you're working in fishing, farming or manufacturing. And there's a class issue there, actually. So, yes, all of those were factors, but I particularly think that those areas that voted most strongly for Brexit in the North and the Midlands were also voting for a changed approach towards economics as well, and an approach which concentrated on rebuilding our national strength rather than being entranced by the prospect of trade deals, because while trade is important, domestic regulation and the domestic direction of your economy is more important.
When you were a minister in the 2019 era, did you anticipate how much of a mistake the Boris wave was going to eventually become? Because I was actually working in Brussels at the time, and Saeed Kamal was my boss, and I remember his argument for supporting Brexit, and there were people in the Conservatives saying this, was that I think that the free movement immigration policy in the EU is racist, and actually we should be open to all sorts of people coming into the UK. And I probably would say maybe some people would argue that argument has aged badly.
Yes, so it is certainly the case, to be with respect to Boris, that Boris has always been a liberal on migration. That doesn't mean that he has ever believed in open borders, but he's definitely a liberal on that issue. I certainly didn't anticipate the numbers would reach the level that they did. I think the numbers were inflated. In fact, I know the numbers were inflated because of both the Homes for Ukraine scheme and Hong Kong BNOs. But even if you take those numbers out, there's still far more than people would have expected or anticipated. There are a variety of factors behind that, but it was undoubtedly a mistake. And I think that when people voted, they wanted migration control, but it wasn't an abstract thing. They also wanted, in particular, low-skill migration reduced. You're right that we shouldn't have an approach towards migration that necessarily favours someone from Bulgaria over someone from Bangladesh. It should be related explicitly to their capacity to add value to our economy.
Michael Gove, very interesting piece. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
An absolute pleasure, Natasha. Thank you.